Okay. Welcome to Boulder City's Fiscal Year 23 Citizen Workshop. I'm Angela Mannanen, Budget Manager. I'm just going to go right into my PowerPoint to discuss this year's fiscal budget. I am pausing. In the beginning? Yeah. Okay, I fibbed. We would like to start with public comment. Sorry, thank you. Please call in at 702-589-9629. Again, the phone number is 702-589-9629 for any questions on the fiscal year 23 operations budget for City of Boulder City. And if you did not want to call in and you wanted to ask a question, you can always email finance@bcnv.org.
I don't have a computer on.
Oh. Again, the phone number, okay. Another. Oh, does anyone in audience want to comment on public comment before we begin? Okay. Since no one in the audience wants to comment either, we'll go ahead and just get started with the presentation. Again, welcome to the fiscal year 23 Citizen Workshop for City of Boulder City. This is the operations budget. So what is a budget? A budget is a fiscal plan setting out anticipated revenue and expenditures for accomplishing a variety of services over a given time. A budget is not cash. In governmental accounting, in order to spend money, it must be included in a budget. Operating budget is expenditures for the current period. And a capital budget shows a financial plan for long-term capital improvements, facilities, and equipment. The budget process starts with preparation, expense estimates for departments in light of available revenues, approval, so it's approved by the City Council and then submitted to the State of Nevada Department of Taxation, implementation, and then evaluation and audit, and its performance is monitored and measured throughout the year. Types of funds with budgets. The City of Boulder City has governmental funds, which includes our general fund, which is the main fund for the entire city, which supports the police, parks and recs, fire, and other general government operations. Our special revenue funds support our general fund. They include our VER fund, which helps purchase vehicles, and also our risk management fund, which assist the city in case of legal costs. Our acquisitions and improvement fund is our capital improvement fund for the governmental improvement projects, such as improvements to parks and also for public safety. Our enterprise funds are our business type funds that should be self-supporting, which includes our utilities, airport, and cemetery. We're going to start with our governmental funds. Projected revenue assumptions for fiscal year 23. The revenue assumptions for fiscal year 23 continue to be fiscally conservative. The general fund is budgeted at $35.6 million, which is $1.3 million higher than our last year's budget. Consolidated tax is $13.3 million. Property tax revenue remains flat compared to prior years at $1.8 million. Soil lease revenues remain stable, increasing with contractual rates, with fiscal year 23 being about $500,000. Where do lease payments go? The budget for fiscal year 23 has $18.8 million in lease payments to the city. This includes $13.3 million, which will go to the general fund, $1.6 million, which will go to the special revenue funds, VERF, risk management, extraordinary maintenance, and compensated absences. And 20% at $3.7 million will go to our capital improvement voter approved fund. The current budget for fiscal year 23 has expenses in the voter approved fund of $1 million for governmental CIP and $2,047,000 for utility CIP, which comes from land sales of Tract 349. The special revenue fund balances for as of December 31st, 2021, our revenue stabilization fund was funded at $2.7 million, and its max is at $3 million. The risk management fund was $2 million with a cap of $8.9 million. Compensating absences was at $2.5 million with a cap of $4 million. Extraordinary maintenance was $3 million with a cap of $8.9 million. And our VERF fund was $2.5 million with a cap of $8.9 million. This is a combined balance of about $13 million as of December 31st. So general fund sources summary. This graph shows the revenues that have come into the general fund since 2019. And you can see they remained around $35 million since fiscal year 2019. There was a spike in fiscal year 21 when there was a one-time solar lease option payment. Where the general fund resources originate. So our intergovernmental, which is mainly our C-tax, and our rents make over 2/3 of the budgeted revenues for the general fund. The intergovernmental is $13.7 million at 37%, and rents and royalties is $13.6 million. Taxes make up $2.1 million, license and permits $1.5 million. Charges for services are $4.1 million, of which $3.1 million come from our golf courses. Fines and forfeitures are $400,000. So revenues by source. In this graph, you can see that most of our revenues have remained relatively stable and flat. If you start from the bottom, the green is intergovernmental, which is mainly our C-tax, and you can see how it's grown slightly since 2019. The blue is our rents, which have that spike again in 21 from the one-time option payment. They have grown. Looking at 2019, they were at $9.2 million, and now in 2023, they're at $13.6 million. The orange is charge for services, which has remained relatively stable at about $4 million. The red bar is property and room tax, which has also remained relatively flat at $2.1 million in 2019 and $2.2 million in 2023. And although our expenses have increased, most of our revenues have remained relatively flat. Fiscal year 23 general fund operating budget. This year's budget uses the expenditures that the city's program will be fully operational in the new year. Increases in the budget include costs for unfunded mandates set upon the court, software to assist with permit processing, and funding for updates to the municipal code. Employee changes for fiscal year 23 is adding a graphic web designer to assist with BCTV and the Boulder City website. This will increase the employee headcount by 1. This will assist with transparency and providing communications to citizens. Also, our Parks and Rec Department secretary will change from a part-time Percival employee to full-time. This will better service the community by having time to implement improvements, including being able to register for Parks and Recs programs online. To summarize our general fund fiscal year 23 budget, the revenues are $35.6 million. Our expenses are $41 million. And these expenses help provide the services expected by our residents. There's transfers from the general fund to acquisitions improvements for capital improvement projects of $3.6 million. There's also $1 million in contingency budgeted, which is not directly rated to a department, but in case of emergency, the council can use this money and budget it accordingly. As I said earlier, a budget is not cash, but cash cannot be spent if it's not in the budget. The use of fund balance, not including transfers and contingencies, is about $900,000. And even with budgeting using some fund balance, The city does stay within its recommended fund balances for operations. General fund expenditures by function. The largest the largest expenses is with our public safety at $14.9 million. And then Public Works is at $6.1 million. Parks and Recreation is at $6.7 million. Community Development's at $1.9 million. General Government is at $5.5 million. And Municipal Court is at $1.2 million. There's an other category of $4.6 million, which includes the $3.6 million transfer for capital improvements and the $1 million for contingency. To summarize our fiscal year 23 governmental budgets, all fund balances are positive with operational reserves as required. There's a transfer from the general fund to acquisitions and improvements of $3.6 million. There's a transfer from voter approved capital improvement fund of $3,047,000. Of this, $1 million is for governmental projects for public safety and parks. The utilities is $2,047,000, which comes from the land sale from Track 349. And the staff will increase from 207.8 full-time employees to 208.8 full-time employees. Going to move on to enterprise funds. Before I do, is there anyone in the audience that has any questions about governmental? Oh, go ahead, come on.
Is this protocol? Is this all right? Okay, because you're asking, so I'm coming. And this might seem like a rudimentary question to someone such as yourself, but I want to have an understanding when we talk about our total revenue versus our total expenses. Mm-hmm. So we're upside down by about 6,000, right? So I'm guessing that we're starting with more than is shown strictly there. Would you please go further into that and help us understand that?
Yes.
Okay,
So
thanks.
the general fund does have a fund balance, which we'll be using actually, so $36 million in expenses versus $41 million whoops, I said that backwards. $36 million of revenues versus $41 million of expenses. So part of that is the $3.6 million is going to transfer out to capital improvement, and that is using fund balance, which has grown over the years just because we've taken in more money than we spent. So when we budget revenues very conservatively because we don't want to budget for money that's not going to be available. And we budget our expenses with some of a what-if situation to make sure that we have enough money throughout the year. Because if you do not budget for it, even if there's cash in the bank, you can't spend it. So that's why expenses are slightly higher than expected and revenues are slightly lower. And we also have things like vacancies and just other things that our expenses come in lower than expected. So every year our fund balance slightly goes up a little bit. Just because even though in the budget the revenues are lower than the expenditures, usually at the year end it winds up being the other way. Just because we spent less than we said we were and we took in more money than we expected. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, not to speak.
Okay.
So it carries over.
It does. So the general fund, thank you, sorry. I totally skipped the whole reason for it. Yep. So the fund balance just stays there. So a budget is not cash. So money spent that goes out of the bank, that the transactions through the year change the cash balance. But yeah, so the budget is just saying we have this much money available and we can budget for this. And these are expenses we can have throughout the year. It doesn't mean we'll pay for every one of these things. It just says fiscally responsible, we know we can do this. So it's a plan, not rather than a checkbook. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to continue on with enterprise unless anyone has any governmental questions. Okay. So the enterprise funds for the city are utilities, airport, and cemetery. And an enterprise fund should be self-supporting and ran like a business. Unlike governmental funds that are supported by taxes, they are supported by charge for services. Our utility fund is actually broken up into 5 smaller funds. The admin fund has a budget for fiscal year 23 of $3.3 million. Our electric fund is 18.6 million with CIP of 4.4. Our water fund is 15 million with CIP of 1.4. Wastewater is 3.6 million with CIP of 1.7. And landfill is 1.3 million. So the combined CIP in our utilities fund is about 7.6 million, which is 20% of next year's budget. So where the utility admin resources are allocated. So the admin fund next year is about 3.3 million. Of this, 40% of it is for central service costs, which include insurance and costs for payroll, AP, accounts receivable, IT, and other similar central service costs. Administration is 28%, which is the director and his supporting staff. Billing and collections is 32%, which includes bank fees, which as of December, we're at $93,000, when the fiscal year budget was only at $91,000. So for fiscal year 23, we're increasing this to $250,000, but we are actively looking at ways to reduce this cost. So changes since fiscal year 22 in the admin fund. Utility billing has requested a personnel shift in changing a full-time meter reader to a part-time utility billing worker, a part-time office assistant to a part-time Percival office assistant. This change will decrease the full-time employee headcount by negative 0.2, and also reduces the budget by $40,000. This allows the employees to focus more on in the office rather than out in the field. The credit card services fees are increasing in fiscal year 23, and the new budget total for these are $250,000. And again, we're looking actively at ways to try to reduce this cost. Where the electric utility reserves originate is 93% charges for services and $1.3 million in voter-approved transfers in from land sales. Fiscal year 23, how electric utility reserves are allocated. The total budget for fiscal year 23 for electric is $18.6 million. Of this, 39% of it is just the purchase of power. It went up from so buying electricity went up from $6 million to $7.3 million in fiscal year 23. This is a significant increase, and one thing we're looking at is possibly moving up the rate study to address this. Also, capital projects are $4.4 million. Changes in the electric fund from last fiscal year are capital projects, which are increasing in costs, and these will be reflected in the meeting in April with the updated CIP. The projected cost in power increased $1.4 million since fiscal year 22. This increase is actually $2 million compared to our original rate study, which also has been updated. And again, we're looking into conducting a new rate study sooner than previously expected to address these changes. The water fund fiscal year 23 revenues, where do they originate? 91% of the water revenues is from charge for services. $100,000 is a transfer in from voter approved capital improvement fund, which is from the land sale tract 349, and also the infrastructure sales tax of $1 million, which can be used for debt or for capital improvement projects. The water fund SNWA fee changes. SNWA increased the pass-through infrastructure fee in January and again in March 2022. This service fee increased an average for a residential customer of $1.79 per month. And we're still researching this, and this will be more in the meeting in April, but customers may see an increase in their July bill in 2022 to reflect this cost. Water fund expenditures. So the budget for the water fund in fiscal year 23 is $15 million. Of that, 34% is just purchasing water. That's $5 million, which is $400,000 higher than fiscal year 22. Capital projects are $1.4 million. The debt is $2.8 million. And combined amortization and depreciation is $2.9 million. Changes in the water fund from last year. Again, capital projects are coming in higher than expected, and they're being monitored and updated, and will be updated in the April meeting. And the other large change in water was the projected cost of water increased $400,000 since fiscal budget 22. Wastewater fund revenues, where do they originate? 78% come from customer charges, and 647,000, which is 22%, is coming from voter-approved funding for capital improvement projects. The wastewater budget for fiscal year 23 is $3.6 million, which 25% is operations, 48% is capital projects at $1.7 million. And again, the large changes in the wastewater fund is just capital improvement costs going up, which is being reevaluated. Landfill revenues for fiscal year 23, 84% of them are from customer charges, and 250,000 is from restricted revenues, which includes the landfill closure fee and construction fee, which is a separate fee that residents can see on their bill. Landfill expenses are $1.3 million in fiscal year 23. 91% of that is contractual services, as trash services are contracted out to Boulder Disposal. Moving on from utilities to the airport. The airport is fortunate that the majority of their capital improvement projects are matched 93.75% by the FAA, and that is why 77% of the revenue coming in next year for fiscal year 23 is actually from an FAA grant of $4.8 million. We're also getting the end of the CARES Act money for the airport at $634,000, and the rest of the funding is from rents and royalties. The expenses for the airport for fiscal year 23 significantly increased, all due to capital improvement projects. The budget will be $7.2 million. Of that, $5.1 million is all capital improvement costs, with the FAA matching at the 93.75%. Operations is 15% at $1.1 million, and depreciation is $1 million. The large changes in the airport fund from the prior year is we'll be using the end of the CARES funding that was allocated to the airport of $624,000. There is a large increase in revenues compared to prior year, which is the FAA grant funding, as the airport only needs to match 6.25% for approved capital improvement projects. Moving on to our cemetery fund. The 92% of the revenue for the cemetery fund comes from charge for services, and 8% comes from miscellaneous fees. And where the cemetery resources are allocated, $150,000, which is 90%, goes to operations, and $16,000, which is 10%, goes to depreciation. To summarize our enterprise funds, all funds have positive balances and operational reserves as required. The only personnel change is a reduction in -0.2 in utility billing. The Utilities Director and Public Works Director are currently reviewing CIP projects and costs, and will have an update at the next budget meeting. This will include possible use of ARPA funds for water and wastewater projects. This is the fiscal year calendar this is the budget calendar for fiscal year 23. The beginning of January, the department directors, myself, and the finance director all met to discuss their budgets and their needs. And then towards the end of January and beginning of February, the same directors and the budget myself and the finance director and the city manager, again, all met to discuss how to allocate the available revenues of the city. On the 3rd of March was the first city council special meeting. Here we are, March 16th, for the citizen budget workshop. April 7th will be the second special meeting with the council. April 15th, I'll submit this tentative budget to the state. May 16th, we'll publish. April 19th, we will have a budget meeting if necessary. May 16th, I'll publish the notice for the public hearing for the final budget meeting on May 24th. That's the city council meeting, which will adopt the final budget and also adopt the capital improvement plan for next year. And then on June 1st, we'll submit the final budget to the state. And that concludes my presentation for the workshop. If you have any questions in audience, come on up.
multifaceted question, so if you want me to stay here to restate the other half of the questions, I will, or I'll sit down. But the first question has to do with revenue sources in the general government. So I'm backstepping just a little. I apologize for that. The reddish orange in that little graph that goes up and down says taxes, and you said property and room taxes. So my question is it only property and room tax?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll save my other questions for that for later. And then the other question I had was into the utility funds. You had mentioned the possibility of moving up a rate study. I was under the impression that Raftellus had already done a rate study for us.
We do one every 5 years.
Oh, and that's just automatic? Thank
Well,
you.
not automatic, but it's a good practice.
Okay, thank you. But that's in our regular practice of schedule, what we do. Okay, thanks for sharing that. And then the other question was, it didn't, and I don't know if you have the detail information to go into it much at all, but on the airport fund revenues, we're pretty familiar with the fact that there was a change from ground lease to hangar lease for that first group of hangars. And so are you in a position to have the information to share with us the change in revenue to the airport because of that? Or if you don't have that, or if it's too much to dig up, I'm not, waiting for the exact dollar figure. But are you able to talk about that a little bit to see how that affected the airport revenue?
It did increase. It's about $100,000 in hangar revenue. Off the top of my head, I can't think of reducing the,
Previous years,
Yeah,
it's much higher.
yes. Because it would reduce the other hangar rental slightly, but the hangar rental itself is about $100,000 a year now, which was very minimal before. I'd say it was around $5,000 or $10,000. That's for the whole year, though. Yeah.
I have a question on the utility fund expenses. In the electric, the 22 budget was almost 28 million, and the electric fund expenses for 23 are only 18. Do you have
It's
some?
capital improvement projects. So the big fluctuation for utilities, always with the expenses like that every year, it's CIP. We had large projects come on last year.
Okay, well, at the end of January, you'd only spent $5 million in the capital funds. Do you think you're going to spend all that 15 million by July 1st?
We definitely do not. We are working on it, and they will bring this back up in April where they're going to reallocate and look at where we are in all those projects. But because they are CIP, they're ongoing, they'll move to
Yes.
the next year. So they're not like the operation budget where it ends at year end. The capital budget rolls on because the money's set aside for those.
So what's not spent in 22 will roll into 23?
Yes.
So the total expenses will go up with
It
the
will.
next budget presentation?
Nope, it will go up at the end of the year when we know what will roll.
So then you'll have to do a revised budget?
No, so there's two different rules. So an operation budget and a capital budget have different rules. And so a CIP budget is allowed to roll over to the next year, where an operation budget as of June 30th, if it wasn't spent, it's a cutoff. Where a CIP, it's for a multi-years. So,
I kind of understand.
okay, sorry.
Can I just add a
Yes,
comment?
please.
Okay. So the operational budget, I just want to say, the operational budget is a set period of time. So it's from July 1st to June 30. What doesn't get spent on June 30, like other than what's obligated and gets, we can't close out on that day. But that budget ends, it closes, and the money reverts back to the general fund. But on the capital, because it's usually long-term, multi-year projects, we don't close those out because lots of times you're in the middle of a project and it just keeps on going. So the rules are different. We don't close those out. We just continue spending for that project. Once a CIP project is approved, it stays as a project until it's either completed, or if they decide not to do it, then we close it out and put the money back where it can be reallocated. But those projects do not close like the operation budget.
You mentioned doing another rate study, and the Raftellus report was just finished last year.
It was started in 19, though. So,
It was finished, though, in fiscal year 2021.
yes. But
So-
because there's been so many changes that we're not including the Raftellus study, such as the high inflation, what CIP projects are costing, our cost of water, our cost of electricity, it'd be strongly recommended that we do another rate study, because there's, the scenario that was in that study is no longer the scenario for the city.
So the rate model, you can't use that information in the rate model
We-
and just continue to use that?
We could, but the outlook of it, we could use that forever, but the outlook with the cost of everything has changed. We cut rates and our rates are,
Okay, the only thing I was gonna add, you're on the right track, but because of all the inflation that has been happening and the cost of projects has skyrocketed, and the cost of business in general has gone up, we could manipulate that model to reflect that, and we do to some degree. We've escalated the cost of projects to some degree, but we're not expert rate model people. So what we feel is when the rate model, we can keep updating it, and we are doing it for any time the utilities department wants us to run some assumptions, we do that. But to say that we want to be the continually updating it, I think at some point it needs a consultant firm that specializes in rate models to come in and look and just take a look-see over our shoulders to make sure we're doing the right thing. And if there's serious changes that need to be recommended, I think it's better coming from a consultant firm that does this throughout the country. I mean, that is their job, rather than us trying to say, you need to raise rates. I don't believe that, I mean, we can say that, but it's better if you have somebody that is an expert in that field that does this all the time and sees different ways of people dealing with the situations that are happening in this country right now. They'll come in and look at the model, and they might make suggestions that we wouldn't even think of making. So that's why we're saying, even though it won't be done in the upcoming budget, it would be something that we probably next year at this time, going into the new budget, which would be beginning July 1st, 23 to June 30, 24, we would probably recommend that, especially if things are still going in the manner they are economically for the country, that we get an expert to come in, like a Raftellus, to look at our whole rate model and make sure that we don't need to make some significant changes.
Yeah, I'm just concerned because we spent $200,000 on a rate study, and then to turn around and do it, like, again, 2 years later, just,
It's not really 2 years, they started like,
but when it was completed.
yeah, when they started was almost ancient history compared to where things are now economically for the country. So, I have some of this experience with utilities, and we always did a rate study within 5 years, and it was just depending on economic conditions. You might go less than 5, you might be able to stretch it to 6, but especially with Boulder City having, maintaining the 4 utilities, and including electric, which is, something that I don't, it just requires somebody to come in and really look at things that has the expertise in designing rate systems. So it's just a wise mode of operation for a city like Boulder City, who offers all these services, to have an independent firm come in, at least consider it every 5 years. I mean, things might change and get better, and, things might calm down, and we say, okay, we're doing okay. But if things continue as they are, which I don't even, I'm not an economist, but it just looks to me like things are really escalating in terms of pricing for things, and utilities, purchasing of electricity, purchasing of SNWA charges, which we'll talk about in April. I mean, there's just a lot of things happening, a lot of dynamic things going on. And at some point, I think we may need to get that rate model revisited.
Okay. And then just a suggestion maybe for future, on these charts, it shows percentages, and it would be helpful if the dollar amounts that you were reading off were on there too, because I can't write as fast as you can talk.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come up? Or we could open the phone also. Okay. So this is the fiscal year 23 City of Boulder City operations budget. If you would like to call in for public comment, 702-589-9629. Again, 702-589-9629. So again, the number to call is 702-589-9629. If you would like to ask any questions about the fiscal year 23 budget for City of Boulder City. Again, if you'd like to call in for the citizen workshop for the fiscal year 23 budget, it is 702-589-9629. Okay. Is there anyone else in the audience before we conclude the workshop? Would like to ask any questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. If you do have any questions, you can always email finance@bcnv.org. Thank you.